So what were the failures of Heath? Well, he was always better at policy details and the business of government than communicating messages to the electorate. He was prickly and abrasive, and sometimes has been described as too honest for his own good. He became isolated in office as Prime Minister and depended too much on the advice of civil servants. He compounded the problems of events with tactical mistakes. The events that we've already looked at, the problems, he didn't make them any better. The Industrial Relations Act in 1971 was done without sufficient negotiation with the unions, and that meant a general refusal to comply. None of the unions registered for it, and it made it impossible to enforce it. The Industrial Relations Act was similar to In Place of Strife, but probably a bit more harsh, and the unions hated it. Direct rule was imposed on Northern Ireland, and that, whilst being probably the only alternative he got, it lost in the support of the unionist MPs. The ending of free school milk under Thatcher as Education Secretary didn't go down too well. That was because of the cuts that the government had to make. Inflation rose to 15% by the end of 71, but economic growth wasn't happening either. This is called stagflation. Unemployment rose above 1 million for the first time since the 1930s. And he was condemned by the left for abandoning the mixed economy, weakening the welfare state, and undermining the principle of full employment, and putting economic calculation before social improvement. And that was before the famous U-turn. The U-turn on his manifesto promises and the Sales and Man policies started when Rolls-Royce was nationalised in 1971. And then, after a year of refusal in 1972, they bailed out the Upper Clyde shipbuilders to the tune of £34 million, and that was a climb down in the face of the threat of public disorder organised by unions. There's a deliberate economic expansion to speed up the rate of growth to join the EC, which created the Barber boom, including tax cuts for the wealthy and cuts in public spending, and all this increased inflation, which went against Heath's previous commitment to reduce inflation. Voluntary wage control to control inflation failed when tripartite talks between the government, unions and employers broke down in 1972, and he used then the law to control prices and wages. Derek Murphy calls this the ultimate U-turn, and no amount of explanation could get away from how far Heath had strayed from the Selsdon Park Hotel claims. There was, however, a slight improvement in 1973. There's widespread support for stages 1 and 2 of the prices and incomes policy. Strike days have been cut in half since 1972, by 1973, and government investment was, whilst it was a U-turn, was beginning to boost the economy. Unemployment had dropped to 500,000, and North Sea oil was due online. The Conservatives had drawn level with Labour in opinion polls, but then the oil price crisis and rise ruined it all, including its effect on the miners' strike in 1973 and 74. The previous strike in 1972 had been won by the miners and gave confidence to those who wanted to use strikes as political weapon, like Arthur Scargill, who had been successful in picketing the Saltley coke works using flying pickets. This miners' strike had also encouraged a right-wing backlash as well. Inflation had gone up so much by 1973-74 that the miners still needed more pay and a bigger pay rise less than 2 years later, in line with pay rises in other industries. Meanwhile, the Yom Kippur War was another Arab-Israeli war, the third one since 1948, meant that OPEC declares the oil embargo, exports stopped and oil prices rose. All this meant the miners were now in a much stronger position as people needed their power. Plus, coal was running low, and they started working to rule from mid-1973. The government ordered the 3-day week to come into effect to preserve power, and that was going to come in from January the 1st, 1974, which it did. Later on in January 1973, the miners called a strike, which in turn caused a balance of payment crisis, and he sees this as a threat to the democratic government being held hostage by the unions, and called an election on who governs Britain. The answer was complex, but it certainly wasn't Heath. Let's have a look at some historical interpretation on this then. Heath believes Selsdon Weekend only reaffirmed policies that had been evolving since he'd become leader, and that didn't mark a change in policy. Heath saw his biggest achievement as joining the EEC. Wilson coined the term Selsdon Man as he thought they were reactionary policies, going back to traditional conservatism. Wilson said Heath's message to the rest of us is, you're out on your own. Derek Murphy says none of the Salterman policies were a new departure for the Tories in 1970, but there was a widespread perception that the Conservatives were offering a new alternative to Wilson. Murphy also says the government was learning bitter lessons that the next Conservative government did not repeat. For example, the housing policy must be controlled by central government in order to sell them off without Labour councils objecting. Murphy says Rolls-Royce can be explained as special circumstances for a firm on the brink of bankruptcy with an international reputation and operations of strategic importance to the country, i.e. jet engines. Murphy says by the end of its period in office then, the Heath government had failed dramatically in its attempts to impose a quiet revolution. Peter Hennessy said when he went to see the Queen on 4th of March 1974, Heath was not alone. The post-war consensus too went with him to resign. Chris Rowe says Heath was a Prime Minister with a clear and detailed programme of policies for the modernisation of Britain. He also said Heath's bad luck was that his time in office coincided with the end of the long post-war boom in 1973, and that it was a period of transition from the post-war consensus to the era of Thatcher and Blair. Mrs Thatcher in particular hangs over the period 1970 to 75 like a dark cloud. Rowe says Heath was good at policies but not at politics. Lynch says the restrictive measures introduced by the government in 1974 were reminiscent of the austerity measures of wartime and in the 1940s. Lynch says wage demands of the unions, which were largely accepted by employers, and the number of days lost to strikes resulted in a decline rather than a growth in productivity. Lynch says it is now known that he told his team of officials to accept any terms on the EC. He assured them that they could always sort it out after Britain had joined. Conservatives on the right thought the Local Government Act reforms were an attack on local identity. And that's it for this one. Thank you very much. Bye bye.